It was me. I was the one. In the dead, suffocating silence of the empty sanctuary, under the patient gaze of a dozen carved saints, I was the one who hurled the heavy brass offering plate through the face of the Good Shepherd. With a rage that felt like acid boiling in my soul, I watched the stained glass window, a memorial to this town's founding families, a pane of glass that had seen more baptisms and funerals than I could count. I watched it explode into 1,000 glittering shards. I remember the sound, a sharp crystalline crack that seemed to tear the holiness right out of the air. I saw the jagged, gaping hole where his compassionate, welcoming face used to be, and in that moment, I felt a sick, fleeting, and utterly hollow sense of triumph. I, Margaret, the 58-year-old Sunday school teacher who had taught generations of children in our small town to love Jesus, to trace his face in that very window. I was the one who desecrated his house. My name is Margaret, and for nearly 60 years, my life was as solid and predictable as the oak pews at St. James Community Church. I was born in this town. I married my high school sweetheart in this town, and I raised my son Michael in this town. Faith wasn't just a part of my life. It was the bedrock, the foundation upon which everything else was built. My weeks were measured by the church calendar, Sunday service, Wednesday Bible study, Friday night youth group when Michael was younger, and the annual Christmas pageant, which I directed for 32 consecutive years. I knew the scent of our church better than I knew my own home. That familiar mix of old hymnals, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet smell of communion wine. My faith was a sturdy, reliable thing. It was a set of rules and promises that made sense. You do good, you are blessed. You pray, you are heard. You trust in God's plan, and you will find peace. I was proud of that faith. I was proud of my unwavering certainty, and I'll admit, I looked with a certain pity, a certain condescension, on those whose faith wavered, or worse, those who had none at all. This story, this confession, isn't easy to tell, because it requires me to show you the ugliest parts of myself. It begins not with a bang, but with a phone call that vaporized the bedrock of my entire existence. My son, Michael, my only child, was killed by a drunk driver. Just like that? One moment he was on his way home from his new job, his whole life a brilliant, shining road ahead of him. And the next, he was just gone. And in the crushing silence that followed, the silence that filled his room and his chair at the dinner table, my sturdy, reliable faith began to crumble. Grief isn't a visitor who comes and goes. It moves in. It unpacks its bags in every corner of your heart, and it poisons everything it touches. My prayers became bitter, angry demands hurled at a silent heaven. The God I had served my whole life, the God I had promised to countless children, was a loving father, had gone quiet. He had abandoned his post. My pride, that certainty I had held so dear, curdled into a venomous rage. I quit teaching Sunday school. I stopped answering the phone when Pastor David called. My own sister, Sarah, a gentle soul, tried to reach me. She leads a small prayer group in her home, and one afternoon she came over, her Bible in her hand, her eyes full of well-intentioned sympathy. She told me her group was praying for me, that God works in mysterious ways, that Michael was in a better place, and I snapped. I can still see the hurt on her face as I spat the words at her. "Your prayers?" I scoffed. "You're worshipping empty platitudes, Sarah. You're sitting in a circle clinging to fairy tales, to make you feel safe from the real world. Well, the real world is cruel, and your God either doesn't care, or he isn't there at all. So take your mysteries and your better places, and get out of my house." She left in tears, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard satisfaction. I was rejecting everything I once held sacred, tearing it down piece by piece. But the final act, the one that truly severed me from my old life, came a few weeks later. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the house was a physical weight, pressing down on me. I got in my car and drove, and my hands, as if with a will of their own, steered me to St. James. I still had my key. I let myself in. The moonlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. And my eyes fell on it, the window of the Good Shepherd, his hand outstretched, a lamb nestled in his arms, the very image of gentle, loving protection. A lie, a beautiful, colorful lie. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I saw the offering plate on the welcome table, solid brass, heavy with the weight of 1,000 Sundays of faithful giving. And in a single fluid motion born of pure, unadulterated rage, I picked it up, swung it back, and let it fly. The explosion of sound was the only prayer I had left in me. It was a scream of betrayal aimed directly at the heart of God. And as I stood there, breathing heavily in the sudden, shocking emptiness, I didn't feel free. I felt utterly and completely alone, a stranger in the house I once called home. Before we go any further into the darkness that followed that night, if this story is resonating with you in any way, I'd be so grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps these stories reach others who might be lost in their own darkness. And I would truly love to know where you're watching from. Please leave a comment below and tell me what city or country you're in. It helps to know we're not alone in this journey. Now, let's continue. The silence that rushed in to fill the space left by the shattering glass was nothing like the peaceful quiet I had always known in that sanctuary. It was a dead silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on me from all sides. The moonlight, which had seemed so serene just moments before, now illuminated the jagged hole in the window like a spotlight on a crime scene. My crime scene. The air grew thick with the phantom scent of my own rage, and I could feel the eyes of every carved saint, every silent apostle fixed on me. Not with judgment, but with a profound, sorrowful disappointment that was 1,000 times worse. I stumbled out of the church, my key feeling like a stolen object in my trembling hand, and drove home through the sleeping town, my heart a cold, dead stone in my chest. The hollow triumph I'd felt for that one fleeting second had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of pure shame. The days that followed were a blur of gray. I became a ghost in my own life. The secret of what I had done was a physical weight. I felt it in my shoulders, in the permanent knot in my stomach. I'd wake up in the morning, and for a blissful second I would forget. And then the memory would crash down on me. The sound of the glass, the gaping hole where the shepherd's face should be. I started avoiding town. A trip to the grocery store became a mission fraught with peril. What if Pastor David saw me? What if Mrs. Gable from the Altar Guild stopped me to chat, her kind eyes searching my face, and somehow just knew? I imagined the whispers, the horrified looks. Margaret? Our Margaret? The Sunday school teacher? The thought was so terrifying, I began to live on canned soup and old crackers from the back of the pantry. My house, once a sanctuary of happy memories of Michael, became my prison. The silence within its walls was no longer a comfort. It was an accomplice. And then, something else began to move in with me. It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It was heavier. It was a presence, an oppressive weight in the air that seemed to follow me from room to room. It was the condensation of my own grief and guilt. In the dead of night, it would settle at the foot of my bed, and the whispers would begin. They weren't audible, not really, but I heard them clear as day in my soul. Failure. They would hiss. You failed him. You were his mother, and you couldn't protect him. You were a woman of God, and you desecrated his house. The whispers would coil around memories of Michael. His first steps, his high school graduation, the last time I heard his voice on the phone, so full of life and promise. The presence would take those beautiful moments and twist them into instruments of torture, reminding me of all that was lost and all that I had destroyed in my rage. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a relentless replay of that night. I would stand in the sanctuary, over and over, the brass plate heavy in my hands. But in the dream, when the glass shattered, it wasn't the shepherd's face that broke. It was Michael's. I would wake up with a scream trapped in my throat, my body drenched in a cold sweat, the sound of that impossible, nightmarish shatter ringing in my ears. I tried to pray. Not out of faith, that was long gone, but out of a desperate animal instinct for survival. I would kneel by my bed, the same way I had taught countless children to do, and I would try to form the words, but my throat would close up. The emptiness where my faith used to be was a cavernous void, and any words I tried to send into it just echoed back, hollow and meaningless. The God I had screamed at was now utterly silent, and I finally understood that this silence was the true punishment. It was the answer to my betrayal. He had simply turned his face away. One night, the loneliness became a physical pain, a crushing pressure on my chest that made it hard to breathe. The presence was particularly heavy, its whispers of failure and shame relentless. I found myself in Michael's old room, untouched since the day he died. I picked up his graduation photo from the nightstand. His smile was so bright, so full of hope. He was wearing the new suit I'd bought him, and he looked so proud. I traced the outline of his face with my finger, and a sob tore through me, a raw, guttural sound of a creature in its final agony. I collapsed onto his bed, clutching the photo to my chest, the cold glass pressing against my cheek. This was it. This was the bottom. I was completely and utterly alone, trapped in a dark, silent house with the ghosts of my son and the monster I had become. There was no way out. The rage was gone, burned out completely, and in its place was nothing but a cold, desolate emptiness. I had smashed the Good Shepherd, and in doing so, I had lost myself. It's a terrifying place to be, that absolute bottom. If you've ever felt a loneliness so deep it feels like you're drowning, you know that seeing a path forward seems impossible. If these stories, these moments of shared darkness and hope, help you feel even a little less alone, please take a second to like this video, and be sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of this journey. It means the world to know we're in this together. I lay there, curled on Michael's bed, the world reduced to the sharp edges of the picture frame digging into my skin, and the salty, metallic taste of my own tears. The great, violent storm of my rage had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape of utter devastation. There was nothing left to break, nothing left to scream at. There was only the hollow ache, the profound, soul-deep exhaustion of a battle that had been lost before it even began. This, I knew, was the end, the final stop. Quiet room, a dead son's photograph, and a silence so complete it was the sound of God having left the universe and turned out the lights on his way out. I closed my eyes, not in prayer, but in surrender. I was ready for the darkness to take me. And then, the sobbing stopped. Not because I willed it to, but because the air in the room had changed. It was a subtle shift at first. The crushing weight of the malevolent presence that had stalked me for weeks, the one that whispered my failures into the dark, simply lifted. It didn't flee. It dissolved, as if it could not exist in what was coming. I opened my eyes. The room was no longer dark. In the corner where Michael used to keep his bookshelf filled with adventure stories, a light was beginning to pool on the floor. It wasn't a light from the window or the lamp. It was a light that seemed to be born from the very shadows themselves. A soft, honeyed glow that didn't cast other shadows, but seemed to gently erase them. It grew steadily, not with a harsh glare, but with the gentle, inevitable beauty of a sunrise. It was warm, and I could feel its impossible heat on my face, a warmth that felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. And in the heart of that light, a form took shape, a woman. Her face. Oh, her face wasn't one I recognized from any painting or statue. But it was a face I felt I had known my entire life. It was a face etched with a sorrow so profound, it seemed to contain all the grief in the world. Yet it was not a face of despair. It was a face of infinite maternal compassion. Her eyes, the color of a deep twilight sky, looked directly at me. And in their gaze, I felt utterly and completely seen. She saw it all. She saw the proud Sunday school teacher, the grieving mother, and yes, she saw the woman who had hurled a brass plate in a fit of blasphemous rage. She saw the ugly, twisted knot of hatred in my soul, and she did not look away. She did not recoil in horror. Her eyes held no judgment, only a deep, heartbreaking understanding, the sorrow of a mother who had also watched her son suffer. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The message radiated from her like the light itself. It was a message of pure, unadulterated love. She simply raised her hand, palm open, in a gesture of invitation. My heart hammered in my chest. Every fiber of my being screamed that I was unworthy. My hands were the ones that had desecrated the church. My tongue was the one that had cursed God. I was filth. I was a traitor. I deserved the darkness, the whispers, the loneliness. But her hand remained, steady and waiting. And with a strength that was not my own, I pushed myself up from the bed. I took a shuffling step forward, then another. The photo of Michael slipped from my grasp and fell silently onto the carpet. I knelt before her, my head bowed in a shame so complete it was a physical agony. And then I reached out, my fingers trembling, brushed against hers, and the world fell away. It was not a jolt, not a shock. It was a current of pure warmth. It poured into me, a liquid grace that flowed into every cracked and broken part of my soul. It felt like a dam breaking inside me, and all the bitterness, all the rage, all the black poison of my grief came rushing out. Not in a torrent, but as if it were being gently drawn from me, replaced by this incredible, overwhelming peace. The whispers in my head, the ones that had tormented me for months, were silenced. Not by a shout, but by a love so vast, so unconditional, it left no room for them to exist. I was known completely, and I was loved completely. The two were not in conflict. In that moment, they were the same thing. As slowly as it had appeared, the light receded, folding back in on itself until the room was once again filled with the gentle dark of the night. I was alone. But the presence that remained was not the oppressive weight of before. It was a gentle stillness. A peace that didn't make sense. The shame was still there, but it was no longer a weapon against me. It was simply a fact, a scar from a wound that was now, impossibly, beginning to heal. And in that impossible silence, the telephone rang. The sound was so jarring, so brutally real, it made me jump. It rang a second time. My first instinct, the old instinct, was to ignore it, to let the world stay outside. But something had shifted. I walked out of Michael's room and picked up the receiver. "Hello," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Margaret?" It was Sarah, my sister. Her voice was hesitant. "I'm so sorry to call so late. I just had this feeling. I was praying and I just felt like I needed to call you to see if you were okay." And for the first time in months, the tears that came were not tears of rage or despair. They were tears of gratitude. That phone call, that simple act of a sister's love, was the first step out of the tomb I had built for myself. It was proof that the grace I'd been shown wasn't just a dream. If these moments of finding a light in the darkest of places are something you want to see more of, please consider liking this video and turning on your notifications. It truly helps to build a community where no one has to feel completely alone in their journey. I hung up the phone with Sarah, my hand resting on the receiver for a long moment, the plastic cool against my skin. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. The heavy, predatory quiet had been replaced by a gentle stillness, a calm that felt like a held breath after a fever breaks. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I walked back to Michael's room, half expecting the light to still be there, but it was gone. The only light was the pale silver of the moon, and it no longer felt accusatory. It just was. I slept that night, a deep, dreamless sleep, the first I'd had since the accident. But when I woke to the gray light of morning, the battle began. The rational mind is a powerful, stubborn thing. It's a fortress we build, brick by brick, with logic and experience, to keep the chaos of the world at bay. And my fortress, even in its state of disrepair, was fighting back. It was a dream, the warden of my mind insisted. A hallucination. You were at the absolute end of your rope, emotionally and physically exhausted. Your brain, in an act of self-preservation, concocted a comforting fantasy. It made sense. It was logical. It was far more believable than the alternative, that a celestial being had appeared in my son's bedroom. I got up, made coffee, the motions automatic. I tried to dismiss it. I tried to stuff the memory of that light, that face, into the same box where I kept other vivid dreams. But it wouldn't fit. The peace that had settled in my soul was too real. The oppressive presence that had been my constant companion for months was undeniably gone. The air in my own home was breathable again. My mind could offer explanations, but it couldn't explain the change. It couldn't explain why the knot of rage in my gut had simply dissolved. This back and forth, this war between what I had experienced and what I could accept, is a lonely, maddening place to be. If you've ever found yourself caught between what your head tells you is possible and what your heart knows to be true, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and turn on your notifications. It's a comfort to know that we're not the only ones fighting these internal battles. As the day wore on, another memory began to surface, sharp and unwelcome. My last conversation with Sarah. I could see her face, clear as day, crumpled in hurt as I spat my venom at her. "You're clinging to fairy tales," I had sneered. A hot flush of shame washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. I, who had mocked my sister's simple, trusting faith, had just experienced something that made her prayer group look like a board meeting. The sheer, unmitigated arrogance of my words echoed in the quiet house. I had stood on the rubble of my own faith and judged her for the way she was rebuilding hers. I had mistaken her gentleness for weakness, her hope for delusion. And what had my own certainty, my own proud, logical faith gotten me? A shattered window and a shattered soul. The shame was a physical thing, a bitter taste in the back of my throat. I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back to being the Margaret who had all the answers. I couldn't go back to the God of my Sunday school lessons, a God who fit neatly into flannel graph stories and predictable parables. That God had died for me in the silence that followed Michael's death. So where did I go? I felt an urge, a deep-seated need to pray, but the old words felt like ashes in my mouth. Going back to St. James was unthinkable. I couldn't face that window. I couldn't face Pastor David. I couldn't face the pitying, questioning eyes of the congregation. I was adrift, without a map or a compass, in a spiritual wilderness. Later that afternoon, searching for an old photo album in the hall closet, my hand brushed against a dusty cardboard box. It was my mother's. I pulled it down, the smell of lavender and thyme rising from it. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed letters and a pair of her old reading glasses, was her rosary. The beads were a deep, milky blue, cool and smooth to the touch, the silver crucifix worn from the passage of her fingers. I had always been quietly dismissive of things like this. In my brand of faith, we didn't need such things. Our relationship with God was direct, unmediated by beads or icons. We had our Bibles and our hymns, and that was enough. I had always thought of it as a kind of spiritual crutch, a bit superstitious, something for those who needed the comfort of ritual over the sturdiness of Scripture. I held it in my hand. It felt foreign, heavy with a history I had never tried to understand, and the war inside me raged anew. "What are you doing?" the old Margaret scoffed. "You're holding a string of beads. This is meaningless. This is exactly the kind of empty platitude you accused your sister of worshipping." I started to put it back in the box, my cheeks burning with a new kind of shame, the shame of being a fool. But another voice, a quieter one, rose to meet the first. "And where did your pride get you? Where did your certainty lead? You broke everything you claimed to love. Maybe you don't know everything. Maybe there are languages of faith you never bothered to learn." I stood there in the hallway, the rosary clutched in my fist, caught between a lifetime of rigid belief and one impossible moment of grace. The choice was between the ruins of a fortress I knew and a path into a wilderness I did not. With a trembling breath, I chose the wilderness. I closed the box, but I kept the rosary. I walked into the living room, sat in my armchair, and just held it. The cool, smooth beads, a strange and solid weight in my sweating palm. I didn't know the prayers. I didn't know the mysteries. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. So I did the only thing I could. I did nothing. I just sat. And in the silence, for the first time in my life, I stopped talking to God, and I just tried to listen. That quiet in my living room, holding my mother's rosary, was the beginning of everything. The silence was no longer an absence of God. It was a space where I could finally hear him. I didn't know the prayers, so I just let the beads slip through my fingers one by one, a silent rhythm that grounded me. Each bead was a step away from the woman I had been, and a step toward. I didn't know what. I just knew I had to keep walking. The first person I told was Sarah. I called her the next day and asked her to come over. When she sat on my sofa, her hands clasped nervously in her lap, I told her everything. The window, the rage, the oppressive darkness, and then the light, the woman, the feeling of being known and loved. I expected her to be shocked, maybe even a little frightened. Instead, she just listened, her eyes filling with tears. And when I was finished, she reached across the space between us and took my hand. "Oh, Maggie," she whispered. "She came for you." There was no doubt in her voice, only a gentle, knowing acceptance. But the rest of the world is not my sister. News in a small town travels faster than a summer storm, and my story, whispered from Sarah to her prayer group, from there to a neighbor, began to spread. The reactions were varied. Pastor David came to see me. He was kind, gentle, his face a mask of pastoral concern. I confessed to him about the window. He sighed, a deep, weary sound, and told me the church's insurance had already covered it. He wasn't angry. He was just sad. When I told him about the vision, he listened patiently, then gently suggested that grief can manifest in powerful ways, that the mind can create profound experiences to help us cope with trauma. He didn't call me a liar. He just wrapped my supernatural encounter in the safe, sterile language of psychology. To him, it was a symptom. To me, it was salvation. Others were less kind. I overheard whispers at the post office. "Poor Margaret. She's finally cracked." Grief does strange things to a person. One of my old friends from the Sunday school committee cornered me in the grocery store, her eyes wide with a kind of fearful pity. "Margaret, you have to be careful," she warned, her voice low. "The devil can appear as an angel of light. You were vulnerable. It was a deception." She was trying to protect me, I know, but her words felt like stones. They were trying to logic me out of my own rescue, to convince me that the hand that pulled me from the drowning waters was a phantom. To all of them, I had only one answer, and I gave it without anger, without argument, just with a quiet certainty that was more solid than anything I had ever known before. It was the most real experience of my life. I found my real refuge in the one place I would have least expected it, my sister's prayer group. They met in her living room every Tuesday night. It was a small, unassuming group of women, mostly Catholic, who I had privately dismissed for years as being overly sentimental. But when I walked in, clutching my mother's rosary like a lifeline, they didn't see the disgraced Sunday school teacher. They saw a pilgrim. They didn't try to analyze my vision. They simply rejoiced with me. They taught me the prayers of the rosary, not as a rote recitation, but as a meditation on a story of love and sacrifice. The symbols I had once rejected as empty ritual, the crucifix, the beads, the images of Mary, began to take on a profound and beautiful meaning. They weren't barriers between me and God. They were windows. They were tangible reminders that the divine had once touched the earth, that holiness could be held in your hand. In that small living room, surrounded by the gentle murmur of prayer, I found a home for my remade heart. The climax of it all, the moment the circle had to be closed, came a few months later. Pastor David, seeing the undeniable peace that had settled over me, a peace none of his counseling could explain, asked me to speak at a special evening service. The theme was Finding Light in the Darkness. I knew I had to do it. I walked into St. James for the first time since that terrible night. The new window was there, a perfect replica of the old one. The Good Shepherd's face was whole again, his eyes kind. But I wasn't the same. I stood at the lectern, my hands trembling, and I looked out at the faces of people who had known me my entire life, and I told them the truth, all of it. I told them about my pride, my arrogance, my belief that my faith made me better. I publicly confessed that it was my hand that had shattered the window, and I asked for their forgiveness. A collective gasp went through the sanctuary. Then I told them about the bottom of the pit and the light that found me there. I told them that the very thing I had rejected, the maternal face of God's love that I had dismissed as Catholic superstition, was precisely what had lifted me from the floor. I looked at my sister, and with tears streaming down my face, I said, "Sarah, I am so sorry. You weren't clinging to fairy tales. You were holding on to the deepest truth of all. My life isn't about having the right answers anymore. It's not about belonging to one church or another. It's about the transformation of a heart. It's about the breathtaking discovery that God's mercy is not a reward for good behavior, but a rescue operation for the rebellious. It's about how that mercy can take the ugliest parts of you, the pride, the rage, the bitter intolerance, and turn them into a testimony of His grace. The journey from pride to humility is something I believe we all walk in some way. If you have ever felt a moment where grace broke through your own logic, a moment where love found you when you felt most unworthy, I would be so honored if you would share a piece of that in the comments below. Your story matters. And if this story has touched you, please like this video and be sure to turn on the notifications so we can continue to share these moments of hope together. My faith is no longer a fortress to be defended. It is an open hand reaching out from the rubble, forever grateful for the hand that reached back.